Well, thanks for having me, and thank you for the kind introduction. This seminar series, as you mentioned, is about privacy and competition. And in the spring iteration of this seminar series, there's I think 2 or 3 GDPR papers. So I think this paper really represents the fixed point that we've landed on, paper about privacy, competition, and the GDPR. So I guess we'll explore this fixed point for 75 minutes together. This paper is joint work with Scott Shriver, who is at the University of Colorado, and Sam Goldberg, who's at Northwestern. Sam's on the call today. Sam's an exceptionally talented PhD student at Kellogg, and the 3 of us actually have a second GDPR paper together too that I'll briefly mention and let review. All right, so the big question that we're trying to answer is, can privacy policy hurt competition? There's a theoretical tension between privacy and competition policy, but this claim lacks empirical evidence. There's several reasons why you might expect these things to be in tension. On the consumer side, you might worry that consent could create this effect, because if you have a privacy law that says that consumers must consent to the firms that receive their data, this actually creates an incentive for the list of firms to be both short and to contain recognizable firms. And both these things could be anti-competitive. There's a couple reasons we might expect this on the firm side as well. So one reason for this tension is economies of scale. Larger firms have more resource for compliance. And this is sort of a general regulation thing. It's not specific to privacy regulation. In our paper, we're actually going to propose a novel mechanism, which is B2B choice of data vendors. And the reasoning here is that if privacy regulation pushes firms to limit their data sharing, then firms may prefer to keep the larger vendors because these vendors have better products or potentially better ability to comply with the law. So we're going to explore these mechanisms in this question today. So we're studying the GDPR, which I don't have to tell you is a general data protection regulation for our friends in Europe. This is something that you live as part of your day-to-day, and why I would actually especially value your feedback on this project, because I'm trying to study this and understand this from the other side of the ocean. But it's important to understand this privacy policy because it is a landmark generational change in privacy policy, and it's a leading example to the world that's been adopted more broadly and guides the discussion of what privacy policies should be enacted in other countries, specifically here in the United States. And like many papers that look at this, we're going to use its May 25th enforcement deadline as an event study. GDPR is very complicated, but we're principally going to think of it as increasing the logistical cost and legal risk associated with data processing, and that's going to have important consequences for the web. Specifically, we study the technology vendor industry that provides an ecosystem for the web to thrive. These vendors help websites do many things. They help websites to monetize themselves with ads, to load and share content on their website, as well as measure and optimize their site traffic. To provide these services, however, vendors often share what the GDPR considers to be personal data. And this industry has faced intense scrutiny, with at least 4 EU countries releasing major reports or statements criticizing the industry, but regulators have not yet issued any fines. To briefly overview our main findings, we do see a reduction in the short run of 15% in websites' use of vendors, and we see a coincidental increase in market concentration of 17% in the vendor market. So our plan today is I'm going to spend a little bit of time just saying some features of the GDPR at a high level, specifically as they relate to this project. Then I'm going to talk about our data, which is fairly novel in an economic context, and discuss, at least at a very high level, our theory model that guides our empirical analysis. And then our results are going to proceed in 3 stages. I'm going to talk about the impacts of the GDPR on vendor use, its impacts on concentration, and some heterogeneity in the response by website that I think has some interesting economics to it. So begin with a primer on the GDPR. So at the core of the GDPR is defining personal data to be in a quite expansive way to pertain to any data for a unique individual. So in particular, this does not need to be personally identifiable data like your name or your email address. This can include pseudonymous IDs like your cookie ID or even an IP address. Now, I already mentioned the enforcement deadline was May 25th of 2018. So we're now 2 years and a bit past the GDPR. The geographic scope of the GDPR is interesting because it affects EU firms, but it also affects non-EU firms. It has this extraterritoriality component to it, whereby if a non-EU firm is targeting an EU resident, then they're subject to the law. And this is actually very important because a lot of non-EU firms, especially in the tech sector, are some of the more important processors of personal data. And so Europe had this provision to try to protect the data of EU residents. Another interesting feature of the GDPR is that it has a sort of federal enforcement design. So there's an EU-wide regulator, but there's also country-wide regulators, and a firm will face one or the other depending on where they're located and where they're doing most of their business. And as I briefly mentioned at the beginning of the talk, we're interested in studying this not only because it affects the 28 countries of the EU, well, I guess 27 now, but it also affects the global privacy regulation conversation. So Brazil, Japan, and South Korea have modeled their laws after the GDPR. And California is sort of a GDPR light. It has some features, but not all of the GDPR. So one of the key principles of the GDPR is data minimization. And as I mentioned briefly at the beginning of the talk, GDPR is a very long, very expansive piece of regulation, but many of its elements support this key principle. So one thing that GDPR does is that it creates a lot of data rights for individual residents of the GDPR. And these rights include the right to access data, to correct data, to erase data, or to take their data elsewhere, including to a competitor potentially, as well as some abilities to object to processing and to object to decisions being made on automated processing. And then on the firm side, they have the rights-based responsibilities, which are just making sure that firms can actually respond to these individual data rights. And this is actually non-trivial. Especially those of us that have worked with firms, we realize that a lot of firms do not have databases, consumer databases, that necessarily speak to each other. So getting these databases to align and to be able to respond to a consumer's data access request is potentially a lot of work for some firms. Firms need to do a data audit. They need to do data minimization. That's referred to as data protection by default. So they want to reduce the data that they're collecting as the default setting. Then there's data protection by design, which is the use of encryption and pseudonymization to protect the information of users, particularly in the case of a breach. And if there is a breach, there's a pretty aggressive requirement to notify the affected people and the regulator within 72 hours. And finally, firms need to appoint a data protection officer, which is essentially a mini regulator within the firm that ensures that these broad processes of data protection in the GDPR are taken into account. So I think the broad takeaway from this is that both the logistical cost and legal risk associated with personal data processing has increased quite a bit. And so we should expect this to reduce the amount of data processing, and we'll show you that may have some interesting unintended consequences. Now, one thing that's interesting about studying the GDPR in this setting is that, as I mentioned before, the GDPR is yet to be enforced in this setting, which is websites' use of vendors. So when we traditionally think about how regulators get firms to comply, we think of the two main levers as being the penalty or the fine and the probability of being hit with that penalty or the probability of the fine. Now, the GDPR, we see that the fine is doing a lot of the heavy lifting. The fines are very high. They're up to 4% of global annual revenues. And I highlight the fact that it's global because this is going to ensure compliance of international firms that may get a small share of their revenue from the EU. Now, the probability of a fine, though, is, I think, probably low. And the reason for that is that the regulators are under-resourced. They don't have a lot of staff or resources. They don't have a lot of staff that have knowledge of how the internet economy works. And that limits their ability to hand down fines. As I mentioned before, we haven't seen any fines to date in this industry. I thought that I had changed that, but it's actually now up to 4 EU countries have criticized the industry for non-compliance. The most recently, the Belgians said that the IAB, which is the industry association that created a framework for which the industry is supposed to be in comply with the GDPR. This Belgian Data Protection Authority has thrown all that out and said that it's not in compliance, but that report hasn't been unsealed publicly. But it's been reported on. So, one of the main complaints about this is the difference between what the GDPR says should be happening and what is actually happening. So, when it comes to consent, the GDPR says that consent should be opt-in, meaning no pre-checked boxes. But de facto, the way that the industry has made this is an opt-out. So the way that this appears for you and in Europe is when you go to a website, you get this pop-up that says, basically agree to continue or click more options and do a bunch of work to say that you don't want to have your data processed. The GDPR says that, in fact, the reject and agree option should be just as easy. And I think you guys may be starting to see that because of pressure from the GDPR regulators, including the UK and Irish regulator, saying that that is not kosher. So one of the challenges, that's interesting. When I when I go to the next thing, it shows up. So one of the challenges in this project is trying to evaluate a policy that's not enforced. Most past literature on the impact of enforcement actions has looked at actual enforcement actions and how firms behaved after those enforcement actions. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to rely on firm beliefs about enforcement to try to understand the impact of the GDPR. And we're going to show you some moments in the data that I think provide some convincing evidence that the beliefs are playing a role. Oh, and again, feel free to interrupt with questions. So do a quick literature review, really a helicopter tour focusing narrowly on the impact of the GDPR. This first paper here, this Judge and Wagman paper, is one of my favorite papers on the subject. They look at TechCrunch data and show a rather large, I think it was 25% reduction in tech venture investment, specifically focused on new firms and firms that work with data, which is a pretty alarming finding, but a very stark finding. The three amigos and I have a second paper where Sam is the lead author, where we look at data from Adobe, and we find a reduction of about 10% in measured site traffic and revenue, which we partially attribute to its consent effects and partially attribute to real effects of the regulation, specifically on marketing. There's a couple other papers that have shown the impact on marketing. So this Gohindo de Matos paper shows that marketing permissioning campaigns can increase consent and increase the effectiveness of marketing, which is an example of how the GDPR is making it harder for firms to market to consumers. The Guy Aridoran papers, you guys actually saw, Guy Saltz presented that. And they show a similar reduction in traffic as observed by an online travel intermediary, which they attribute to consent. And they show kind of one silver lining to this is that the remaining traffic seems to be favorably selected, finding we also find in our Adobe paper. So that somewhat attenuates its effect on firms. And reason I'm hesitating here is I just added, but it's not reflected in here, this paper by Shane Greenstein and his co-author Zhang, that shows that the GDPR had no effect on the internet at the interconnectivity level. So it did not have a significant effect or a large enough effect on the data being moved around the GDPR that it had an effect there. And I realized this morning that I had been presenting this without including that paper in there, so I apologize to those co-authors. That's a really great paper as well. And then we come to this Pukert paper, which is notable because they have, it's very complementary to what we're doing. They show that the GDPR increased concentration in the web vendor market. So I encourage you to check that out as well. I think it really builds a sense that this finding is robust. And finally, we have the Lefrere paper, which shows that the GDPR reduced cookies. I think they're focusing on publishers. So they want to see, did the GDPR affect publishers? And they do see a small drop in the site traffic from EU visitors, but they don't see a drop in content, which they expected to see when it's harder to monetize. Of course, one of the findings of this paper is that the industry pretty successfully held on to the status quo. Now, I'll really briefly go through the computer science literature. We're going to be doing an exercise of looking at third-party interactions, including cookies. And so this is something that is more traditionally a computer science exercise. And that literature has shown there's a large decrease, especially on private sites and news websites. A paper that's really important to us is this Sanchez paper that shows that most sites are tracking consumers without their consents, something that we're going to show as well and actually rely on. And then some other papers showing the impact that this has had on cookie syncing and privacy policies. All right, so I'll now move to data and theory. And again, this data is less familiar to economists, and I encourage any questions you might have. All right, so when you visit your favorite website, your browser interacts with the first-party domain of that site. So here I've gone to theguardian.com. But at the same time, your browser interacts with potentially dozens of third-party domains owned by vendors selected by the website to provide these various services of monetization and social sharing and content elements. Now, you can see here I've used an extension to Chrome called Disconnect that allows me to visualize this. And you see some logos that you recognize, like Google and Yahoo and Twitter. And down here we've got Facebook, Google again. This one you may not recognize. It's the Trade Desk, which is a large firm in this space as well. Now, kind of stepping back from this setting, the GDPR is a hard thing for us to study empirically, because normally we do not get to see how firms use and share personal data. This is not something that is typically broadcast. However, in this instance, this function is being outsourced to the browser. And because of extensions like this, we are able to observe the website's network of vendors, which gives us a really powerful tool to understand the impact of the GDPR at scale. So our data collection proceeds as follows. We use a VPN service to simulate ourselves as coming from within the EU. Specifically, I chose France as the country because I speak French. I don't speak German. Sorry, guys. And we use this Python program developed by a researcher at CMU named Tim Liebert. And this is a very powerful program that allows us to record all the third-party domain interactions that arrive when we visit a website through HTTP requests and JavaScript requests and basically any requests that would generate those interactions. And then, as I said, we do this at scale. So we repeat for 28,000 top websites, and we do this regularly throughout 2018. Specifically, we do it 14 times. And to be a member of our sample, you have to be one of the top 2,000 websites in one of each of the 28 EU countries, as well as the US, Canada, or globally. So again, this data is something that computer science typically work with, but it's less something that economists work with. So I want to walk you through 3 simple examples of how this works to give you a sense of what our data looks like. So in our first example, we're going to see a case where there's personal data as defined by the GDPR that's transmitted via a first and third party cookie. So we have, again, I've visited theguardian.com, and theguardian.com is going to put a first party cookie on my browser. And that cookie can be as simple as a text file that has a user ID with a unique identifier. So in this case, ABC123. And this is very useful to the Guardian and to yourself as a browser, because, for instance, if you are a Guardian subscriber, then the Guardian will be able to remember that, and they'll be able to get rid of this junk at the top here and show you all the content that you've paid for the right to be able to see. So essentially, this performs the function of allowing the website to remember who you are as you walk through the site. Now, this is also an example here of a third-party cookie. So in this case, the Guardian has selected Google's ad vendor to monetize its site and to allow Google to interact with the user. To do this, the website writes some code that tells the user's browser to interact with doubleclick.net, this domain here owned by Google. And so the browser is going to visit doubleclick.net and get a third-party cookie if it doesn't already have one. And you'll note that doubleclick.net uses a different cookie user ID. So now we have EFG456. And this is for a couple reasons. Number one, doubleclick.net cannot read the first party cookie that theguardian.com has set, or at least not without some additional machinery. We'll show you in a minute. The second reason is that doubleclick.net may have placed a cookie on your browser at another website. So for instance, if you go to Macy's or some other store, this is going to allow that store to retarget you when you visit theguardian.com, because it's going to have the same identifier across these two sites. I think I saw a question in the chat.
Right. So Dan Savell is wondering, what type of VPN did you use? Is it a VPN that major websites have flagged your IP as associated with a VPN?
Yeah, that's a good point. So I use a company called NordVPN, N-O-R-D VPN, and potentially an issue is that so one thing that we're going to find is, like, off the top of my head, I want to say 5–10% of the websites don't scan. Some of them never scan, and that may be as Dan points out, that they're being blocked. It could be for other reasons as well. And we're going to use fixed effects in our model to soak up these differences to make sure we're comparing apples to apples. But we do get pretty high coverage, and so I don't really think that that's going to be important for interpreting the findings. But it's a good point. That's part of what's happening in the background. All right, so I want to just go to our second example here, which means I have to click back here. So here's an example of personal data being transmitted without a third-party cookie, which is important to realize that this can happen even though we measure third-party cookies. That's not synonymous with personal data. So in this example, the Guardian.com has decided to work with Google Analytics, and Google Analytics provides a service that allows the Guardian to understand where its users are coming from and with what frequency and what they're doing when they visit the Guardian.com website. So in this case, the Guardian is installing a bit of code on their website. Specifically, it's going to be a JavaScript code. And what's going to happen is that when a user visits the Guardian.com website, the browser is going to generate a very long URL that it's going to visit. And that URL is going to include many pieces of information, like the Guardian.com's ID and the page ID for the specific page that the user is visiting. But it's also going to include a user ID. And you note here that now the user ID is ABC123. So this is by design that the Guardian.com is sharing its first-party cookie information with Google. And this is going to allow Google to understand who is a unique user and report that information back to Google, to the Guardian. But to do so in a way that doesn't allow for tracking across third-party domains. Sorry, tracking across websites, at least in this instance. And then finally, the more germane thing is that you can have a third-party domain interaction that does not transmit personal information. So here, theguardian.com has decided to work with a company called fonts.com to get content, specifically fonts, to load on the browser. But this is happening without any user ID being transmitted. All right, so now to give you a sense of the structure of the data, I think it's helpful to see some summary statistics to see how this pieces together. So these summary statistics are at the level of the website. And we see that on average, websites are using 16.3 third-party domains. And this varies quite a lot. So from 0 all the way to 199. As a general rule, if you have if you have advertising on your website, then you typically work with many ad tech vendors, and that pushes this number to be higher. So specifically, yeah, news content is going to have many more of these. And we're actually going to do our analysis at the vendor level, which you see is a little bit smaller here, 14.4 on average. The only distinction here is that some vendors, like Google's ad vendor, may have multiple third-party domains that interact with your browser, but they all feed the same service. And so we're going to simplify a little bit to eliminate that duplication, which is not informative from an economic perspective. And then we have third-party cookies is 7.3, so roughly a little less than half of this. This is a very strong indicator that personal data is being used, but as I said in the previous example, not a sufficient statistic. 92% of websites are using first-party cookies. And then we use a categorization scheme, which I'll talk about on the next slide. And we're able to categorize about 2/3 of the vendors in our data, 8.4 on average. Now, again, this is at the website level. This is some website level statistics that come from external data. So we were able to get the Alexa rank of websites. And by construction, we have the #1 website. The median website is the 58,000 website in the world. And then our long tail here is the number 6.5 million website in the world. And that's what happens when you include the top 2,000 websites from Latvia in your sample.
Out of curiosity, what's the #1 website according to Alexa rank?
Google.com. Yeah, not too surprising. And then finally here, from the Alexa Web Information Services, we're able to get a sense of the share of users by country. And so on average, our sample has 70% of users from the EU. The median is 89.9%. So obviously by construction, we've tilted our sample to be heavily towards the EU. However, we do get the full range of websites that have no traffic from the EU to websites that have 100% of their traffic from the EU. All right. So one of the challenges here when we get to it, we were interested in market concentration. And so because these different vendors are performing different services, we want to try to break them into different categories and call those categories markets. So we're going to rely on an external categorization by Tim Liebert, the same person that created our Web X-ray tool, to create this categorization. It's something that's hard to do because sometimes the website third-party domain is going to be Google Analytics. It's very clear what it is. And sometimes it's going to be a very long string of letters and numbers that's very unclear what it is. So we thank Tim Liebert for doing that hard work to make that possible for us. So the largest category here is advertising. Not surprising given the importance of that and the amount of third-party cross-site tracking that happens to make advertising possible. So on average, we see 4.35 advertising vendors per website. Hosting is a broad umbrella category that includes web hosts like Amazon Web Services, as well as website code. So for instance, Google APIs or JavaScript code. It includes video serving from YouTube or Vimeo, and fonts like fonts.com example that I brought up earlier. Then the third category is audience measurement. So these are services like Google Analytics or Adobe Analytics that help sites to measure their traffic, to traffic source, to traffic activity. Typically, almost all websites are going to be using this. They find this data to be important, and some websites are using more than one. So that's how we get up to a little bit higher than one on average. And then social media, this is for social sharing and liking. Some of this is for advertising conversion tracking as well, but we see our familiar names here, the Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, all these things. Design optimization is kind of some upgraded capabilities on top of audience measurements. So there's things like A/B testing is something that these companies do. And then at this point, we get down to really small companies, or at least companies that are not being used very much. So security is for protection against, for instance, denial of service attacks. Native ads is a form of advertising. CRM is basically if there's a messenger that pops up, messenger window that pops up when you visit a website. And finally, privacy compliance is one of the large privacy compliance companies that creates, for instance, dialogues when you visit a website. And this is all kind of baseline levels prior to the GDPR. All right, so I'm going to talk about our theory model at the very high level, as you can see here, because there's no math. We took a model off the shelf and we augmented it to have features of the GDPR. We did this because we wanted to guide our empirical analysis. And in our theory model, we proposed an equilibrium model of the web technology industry, where on on one side, you have differentiated vendors with asymmetric costs. And on the other side of the market, we have a representative website that chooses vendors in order to improve their revenue. So as I said, the thing that we added to this model is this regulatory incentive, which has these two components of the fine and the probability of the fine. The fine is going to be 4% of global revenue, and the probability of the fine is going to be connected to sites' beliefs about enforcement. And the key comparative statistics that we get from this model are that as sites' beliefs about GDPR enforcement increase, we're going to see fewer active vendors in equilibrium, an increase in concentration in the vendor market, and we should see that high revenue sites cut vendors the most. So I'll walk through this again when we get to the empirical results, but just the high level intuition behind this is that the probability of the of enforcement of the GDPR essentially acts as a tax. And so that tax is going to make it so that websites want to use fewer vendors that help increase their revenue. So I think that's pretty intuitive. The increased concentration effect comes from this feature that our model has differentiated vendors with asymmetric costs. So essentially, when you start to reduce vendors, these vendors vary in their cost benefits. And so the websites with the vendors with the worst cost benefit proposals or propositions are going to be the ones that you drop first. And these are also going to be the ones with the smallest market share, which is going to increase the concentration of the market. And finally, this is kind of another sanity check as we go to the data. If you have websites that have a higher revenue shifters, like having more traffic and more ads on the website, then you're going to be using more vendors in equilibrium. And so you essentially have more fat to cut, more vendors to cut. And that's why we see that finding. All right. Now I want to push forward and show you the results of the data in the data. So beginning with the impact that this had on vendor use, we see that in this plot, we're looking at the average number of vendors used by websites over time. And we can see at the beginning of our period, which is in the immediate lead up to the GDPR, that websites are using 14.4 vendors on average. Now, 1 week later, this falls to 12.4 vendors. And this is a 15% reduction in vendor use. And we're going to be referring to that in this talk as the short run effect of the GDPR. Now, obviously, we would have liked to have collected a longer pre-period before the sample, but we know from auxiliary data and from related research, including that paper I mentioned earlier by Pukert and his co-authors, that the pre-trend is actually quite flat. And it does seem that websites waited to the last minute to make changes to their website. And one piece of evidence for that is that 3/4 of this drop happens within a few days of the enforcement deadline. So these data pools are just within a few days of each other. And the drop here is very stark, but also the return to the status quo is very stark. The fact that this erodes by the end of 2018. And this is a really important point. I want to come back to it in a couple slides, but first I want to unpack this first one drop to understand what is and is not happening here. All right, so why do we see this drop? Well, our explanation is that websites are making decisions about which vendors to work with, and they are choosing some vendors to drop. We want to rule out some important alternative explanations that you may have in your mind. So you may be concerned, for instance, that vendors are just exiting the market. They just see that the writing's on the wall here, privacy regulation is going to make the going tough, and they just walk away. And there is some exit in our data, but the largest exiting vendor is only appearing on 78 websites, which is 0.3% of our sample. So this is really not the dominant story we're seeing in the data. Another concern you may have is that anecdotally, you saw that some websites started to block EU users. And in fact, one researcher, I think he's a private researcher, found a list, created a list of 1,300 or almost 1,400 sites that were blocking EU users. It turns out that that's not the dominant story in our data. Only 13 of these scanned sites match up. Only 13 of our 28,000 or 27,000 websites were on this list. We identify another 29 websites that are blocking EU users manually. But one kind of interesting side finding of this research is that only 10 of these 42 blocking sites were actually materially dropping their third-party domains. So there's only 10 of them were reducing the third-party domain interactions. Sorry, yeah, 10 of them were reducing their third-party domain interactions below 10, at least a week after the GDPR. So kind of making that a little bit more clear, it means that many of these websites were blocking EU users, but were continuing to fire all these third-party domain interactions. So they sort of had the illusion of privacy, but not the actual reality of privacy, which is maybe darkly humorous to some of us. And then the third thing is that it's not the case that sites are waiting for consent. And this really matters because if they were, then that would affect our visibility into the network of vendors that websites are using. And the basic reason we think this is that we don't see this, this extensive margin where websites suddenly start loading zero third-party domains. Specifically, we focus on the websites that appear to be using an external privacy extension to get consent, and we find no change in websites loading zero third-party domains. And this is supported by other research. So this Sanchez-Rolla paper that I mentioned earlier says that finds that 92% of websites set at least one identifier cookie before receiving consent. This is in July 2018. Subsequently, at the end of last year, the Irish Data Protection Authority wrote a report where they scanned something like 50 or 100, I don't quite remember at the top of my head, sites specifically targeting Irish users, and they found that this practice was prevalent for the majority of websites even 2 years later. I think it's starting to change in the data, but the regulator made it very clear that they wanted that to change. In fact, the deadline for making that change was October, so actually this month. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in Ireland. I see this question in the chat. Thanks again, Dan. Did any vendors temporarily shut down or temporarily exit to implement new features to better comply with the GDPR? That's a good question. I am not aware of ones that temporarily exited and came back, but I'm going to show you some data that's relates to this here in the next couple slides. But that, and yeah, so a couple questions coming up, and it relates to what I'm just about to show you, which is, why is it that we see this drop that erodes over the end of 2018? So our favorite explanation for this is a combination of two things. We think that it reflects, number one, falling enforcement beliefs. So the websites believe prior to the GDPR that they should be afraid of the regulators. And then after seeing almost a year of no enforcement, they start to ease off and believe that enforcement is less likely. And the second explanation is just natural technology growth. This is a very dynamic sector. It's tended to expand over time. And so we see this pattern in US from the Buchert paper, and it's not surprising that the industry would continue to grow. But you're interested in these alternative explanations. So one thing that kind of came up in Dan's question is this entry or exit? And on net, there's kind of no story here. So we looked at vendors that exit. The total reach of those websites of those vendors is about 8,000 websites, about 2% of our pre-period sample. The total reach of vendors that enter is about the same, so closer to 8,500 websites in total for 2.2% of our sample. And so there's the difference between these things is almost zero. And so that's not the dominant story that we're seeing here. And one concern you also may have is that maybe these websites just add back their initial vendors. So maybe these vendors don't have their ship together. Oh goodness, that's worth a sip of coffee. Maybe these vendors aren't ready to comply with the GDPR, and they learn how to comply with the GDPR, and the websites just welcome them back with open arms. And so the way we examine this is we look at the vendors that are dropped in the short run, and we look in the long run at the end of 2018 and ask, are the same ones brought back? And it turns out that about a third of those are readopted, and 2/3 of those are new ties. So this is part of what's going on is adding back initial vendors, but I think the dominant story is this tech growth of getting new vendors to do new things or to do old things better. And then finally, there's this issue of compliance. So maybe our vendors just learn to comply. So there's a couple problems with that argument. The first argument is that the first problem is that compliance with the industry's framework is pretty straightforward. They've made it very simple. Essentially, the framework allows to pass consent strings to these different vendors, and you just have to register for that. Though, it's not nothing. You probably should talk to some lawyers and make some decisions about how you're going to comply with the law specifically. And then the challenge here is that, it's one thing when I present this talk is people say, well, we're back to status quo by the end of 2018, so maybe this is just not very important. And the important thing to realize is that the industry is not actually in compliance with the GDPR. And you don't have to take my word for it, because the EU regulators have said multiple times that the industry does not comply with the GDPR, including most recently the Belgians Data Protection Authority, which has said that this IAB TCF, which is the Transparency and Consent Framework, the consent signals that are being sent out when you press OK or not OK when you visit a website, that's not kosher. What this means is that we don't really see this industry in a state of compliance, and we're going to focus on the short run effect of the GDPR, because we think that this is most informative of when websites' beliefs of enforcement is highest. Now, I've seen a few questions come in through the chat. Berner, would you mind just letting me know what?
Sure. Lefteria had a follow-on question about Dan's earlier question. She was wondering, what about the small vendors? Could they not quickly adopt to the new regulation? That's why they exited. I feel your second point on this slide sort of partially answers that question. Maybe you have something to add.
Yeah, I think that could be potentially part of the story, and we don't get a direct signal of who is in compliance, in part because compliance is very much a relative term. So we're going to show you that websites are more likely to stick with the large vendors than the small vendors. And we think that some of that is just a superior value proposition that these large vendors have. But another part is that they may have a superior ability to comply with the law. And that we're not going to be able to say much about. The one thing that I can say now is that one of the findings I'm going to show you is that Google is really hanging on here with websites. That's part of the story. Google websites are really just reluctant to drop Google vendors, which is interesting because they, at least until pretty recently, have declined to participate with this industry framework. So that meant that websites actually had to do more work. They had to send a consent signal to the smaller vendors and medium-sized vendors that are cooperating with the IAB, as well as a separate signal to Google. And it wasn't just Google, this is Facebook and Twitter were in the same bin. So it's kind of the opposite story in some way, that the large vendors made the websites do more work, and still the websites were wanting to stick with the large vendors. Thanks for some great questions, guys. All right, so I showed you these findings in aggregate. I want to break them down to different categories. So we see a 15% reduction in vendors in the week after the GDPR. When we look at the #1 category, which is advertising, this is the category that has the largest hit, so a reduction of 25%. So it's actually a majority of this reduction is coming from advertising. I think that's pretty intuitive. The rest of our categories are all falling by about 10%, except for privacy compliance, and I think it's pretty intuitive that privacy compliance would actually increase as a result of the GDPR. All right, so now we get to the concentration findings. So here what we're asking is about concentration in a relative sense. So we know that vendor use is falling post-GDPR, and most vendors are actually worse off after the GDPR. So we're not asking about absolute market shares. We're asking, do these larger vendors get a larger share of the smaller pie? So do we end up in this situation, or is it pretty much the same, or indeed less concentrated in a relative sense? So in order to measure this, we are going to use reach to define our market share. So our reach is the number of websites that are using a vendor, and the vendor's relative market share then is going to be their own reach divided by the total reach of their competitors. And to compute concentration statistics, we are going to use the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, which is the sum of the squared of the market shares. So this is going to go from 0 points to 100,000 points, where 0 is perfectly competitive and 100% or 10,000 is a monopoly. To fix ideas here, here's a quick example where websites are looking at website analytics vendors. And so site A and site B is using Google Analytics, site C is using Adobe Analytics. And it's pretty intuitive here that the reach of Google Analytics is 2, Adobe is 1, and so the market shares reflect that. It's 2/3 and 1/3. Now, this is a reasonably typical way of defining market shares. One challenge, though, is that we aren't able to augment these market shares with any sense of revenues or costs. We don't observe that. We only observe the vendor choices of websites, and so our market shares are going to reflect that. That also means that multi-homing gets a little interesting here. So here I've changed the example so that site B is using 2 analytics providers, Google and Adobe. And that's going to mean that the reach is now 2 for each, and the market shares are 1/2. And that's going to make it so that our market shares are nice and they add up to 1. But relative to our previous example, we see that Google hasn't lost reach, but they've lost relative market share. And so one feature of this this way of measuring the concentration is that if there's a lot of multi-homing, it's going to depress these market shares and make it so that the HHIs are lower. There's a couple more questions coming in.
Yeah, there you go. We have 2 questions. One, I'm sorry for pulling you back to the previous slide on the breakdown of the changes. Martin Pikes is wondering, isn't it? I guess one more. He's wondering, isn't it ironic that there's a drop in security vendors is particularly large, even though it's starting from a low base?
Yeah, that's a good point. I should take another look at that to see who is being dropped, because there's a couple different companies within security, and it is actually a good point. And it is ironic. So I should see if it's because Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges of these things is that, like, yes, privacy is a good thing, but having identifiers for users allows companies to do some work, like protecting themselves from ad fraud and protecting themselves from potentially fraud that could take down their website or criminal activity that could take down their website. So I think it does speak to some of the hard challenges here.
And another question by Dan about your reach measure. He's wondering, does this use total reach of all vendors or only similar vendors in some sense?
Oh, well, I'll come to that here. So essentially, we're going to show both. So first, I'm going to show you the all vendors thing, and so that's what I've done here. I've calculated an aggregate HHI for the entire vendor industry, which is admittedly artificial, but gives you a flavor of what's going on here. I think this is important because you see that this plot is the mirror image of the previous plot I showed you. So we see that HHI increases quite a lot in the short run. It increases to 17%, but then this effect is just attenuated over time. Again, as the vendor's choices basically go back to the status quo, or at least the vendor use goes back to the status quo. Now, we're interested in the short run. I think I've already made the case that given that this hasn't been enforced, the short run is probably more informative of when the beliefs about enforcement are highest. But this, I want to highlight, validates our second model prediction that the GDPR increases concentration. And the model's explanation for this is that vendors have asymmetric costs, and so websites are going to drop the high cost vendors, and because they are high cost, these vendors have smaller shares to begin with. So in other words, vendors with large shares have large shares because they provide greater value. So websites prefer to retain these large vendors when the GDPR pushes websites to reduce data sharing. So now I want to go to Dan's question here. Sorry, go ahead.
For that argument, I think I'm missing something. Do you have an explanation why that asymmetry in cost and dropping the high cost vendors wasn't also a firm strategy before the GDPR? Why did they all of a sudden realize, oh wait, there are these high cost vendors, let's drop them now? Wouldn't that also have been a profitable approach before the GDPR? Do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, so essentially based on the revenue shifters that your firm has, it's going to be optimal for you to engage more or less vendors. And so we show that that pattern matches the data in the baseline. So really it's not a change in the cost side, it's a change in the benefit side. So the benefits are lower in expectation because now you think that if you do all this sharing of personal data, you have some chance you're going to get a fine from the regulator. And so because that the benefit side has changed, it's going to be the case that you're going to reduce the number of vendors. Great. Okay. So the concentration not only increases in aggregate, but it increases for the top 4 vendor categories. And that's important because these top 4 vendor categories represent 94% of all vendors. So we see the largest effect in advertising, which is important because that's where we see the largest drop in vendor use, and it's about commensurate. It's 25% increase in concentration there. And then the next 3 categories increased from between 2 to 6%. The picture here is more mixed down here, but I think that reflects a couple of things. One is I don't think we're showing an iron law of the universe here. This is going to vary, for instance, by the extent to which you're using personal information. And also there's important ceiling effects here. Like the concentration here is in some cases very close to monopoly. So we may see some ceiling effects. All right, now I'll try to briefly move through this slide because I know I'm running a bit late, but this is robust to using alternative concentration metrics. So concentration ratios are basically going to match the HHI sign by construction, but it helps break things apart. One thing that I think is really interesting is that we introduce a new metric for competition, which I refer to as head-to-head competition. It's a pretty simple thought experiment. It's just if a website is using a dominant vendor and a competitor before the GDPR, and they decide to retain only one of them after the GDPR, how often do they choose the dominant vendor? And this is interesting because it's very diagnostic of what's going on here. So when it comes to advertising, 99% of the time, Google is winning these head-to-head battles. When it comes to audience measurement, Google Analytics is winning these 94% of the time. And in social media, Facebook is winning 87% of the time. And finally, I've described before that just defining these markets is actually a pretty hard thing to do. And so we show across a couple different market definitions that this finding holds. All right, so I want to walk you through 3 quick extensions that give you an intuition for what's going on here. The first extension, we divide vendors by whether they are likely using personal data or unlikely to do so. The way we do this is we say, if you are using a third-party cookie, then it's likely the case that you're using personal data. However, that's not a sufficient statistic. We know that there's some types of vendors, like site analytics vendors, that just need to be using that personal data to be doing their jobs. So when we put those both together, we see that there's a larger effect among vendors that likely use personal data, so 19.3% versus 5.6%. This is important for a couple reasons. One is that this is kind of a diagnostic that the GDPR is having an effect where we expect it to have, which is on personal data. But this is also policy relevant because it means that the personal data itself is becoming more concentrated in the hands of the larger vendors, which is an important unintended consequence of the GDPR as well. And that could be, in some sense, self-sustaining to the extent that these data ownership is a moat around competition. Next, we look at the role of consent. So sites that use a consent platform and those that don't show a pretty similar increase in concentration. We expect that that could be different, but the reality of the GDPR is that websites were not providing a list of vendors, or at least were not providing that without the user having to do multiple clicks. And because this feature is less salient, it's not really showing up in the data. So that's not too surprising. And finally, we come to this role of the top 2 companies, Google and Facebook. Concentration with everybody included, I've already shown you, increases by 17.3%. However, when we exclude these 2 companies, we actually see a decrease in concentration, and the HHIs fall quite a lot. So when you take these big whales out of the marketplace, even the minnows don't grow into whales. They're still, small fish. And again, concentration is flat or declining. So it really is a story of websites sticking to these two websites, to the 2 vendors that are owned by these 2 companies. So, a summary then, or a cute summary of this would be that we should revise the axiom that nobody gets fired for choosing IBM to include these modern tech giants of Google and Facebook. All right, so to the last set of results, and these will be fairly quick. I think this is interesting because it illuminates some interesting economics of what's going here, and it does show you these moments that I hope will convince you speak to the regulatory, the beliefs in enforcement. So the first thing we do is we take this drop that happens in the short run, and we're going to break it apart by characteristics of the websites. And we're going to do so using a regression, but I'll show you one dimension which I find really interesting, and that is the share of EU users. So over here, we've got websites with almost all their traffic from the EU, and over here, we've got websites with no traffic from the EU. And you see some big differences. So over here, websites with between 90 and 100% of users from the EU drop their vendors by a little over 2. And on this extreme, websites with between 0 and 10% of their users from the EU drop their number of vendors by 5. So this is kind of an interesting and potentially unintended consequence of the GDPR, that we see a larger effect on this extreme, because this means that the websites with the most EU traffic actually do the least to protect the privacy of their users in comparison to the websites that have a small share of their traffic. So what's going on here? We think that this reflects, the incentives of the GDPR that place a 4% penalty on global revenues. And this means that sites with few EU users have relatively little to gain in terms of revenue from the EU, but relatively more to lose from a penalty on their global revenues. And so we see this perverse effect that sites with the greatest share of EU users do the least to cut vendors. And I kind of put this another way, I have other work showing that if you use cookies, you basically double the prices that your ads fetch. So over here, these guys are choosing between doubling their ad prices and a 4% fine, and they, make a smaller change. And the people over here that are, if they've got 10% of their users, maybe that's about 5% of their revenue compared to a 4% fine. The calculus is quite a lot different. And so they see a much larger effect of the GDPR. And finally, we have this discontinuity here for websites with 0% of users from the EU. And many of these websites are not actually subject to the GDPR, so they don't need to be making changes. And that's why we see a discontinuity. Finally, in regression form, we're going to interact the short run effect of the GDPR with various characteristics of the users. And first, I'm going to replicate this finding that the compliance is increasing. The number of vendors you retain is going to be increasing in the share of EU users. And next, our model predicts that websites with greater revenue shifters are going to cut vendors the most. And we're going to proxy for this using several metrics. We're going to use traffic, which is inversely related to site rank. So we're going to use actually site rank, and we're going to use the number of ad counts on the website, and the income, which is very coarsely measured by the GDP per capita of the share of users coming from a certain country. And we see that the sign has the predicted sign that websites with these high revenue shifters tend to cut the most vendors in the short run because they are finding it optimal to have more vendors and therefore just have more fat to cut when they face this 4% fine. Now, the last set of findings here is looking at the evolution of vendors post 2018. So we want to understand, why is this going to come back to normal? And one of the, I think, more diagnostic and interesting stories to come out of this is that we noticed that after the GDPR, the average number of vendors grew slowly in countries like Denmark and the Netherlands, but grew rapidly in countries like Bulgaria and Poland. Now, this is interesting because the GDPR is supposed to harmonize regulation in the EU. As I mentioned a long time ago at the beginning of the talk, this is still enforced in part at the country level. And so we went out and found a survey metric from the EU that measures regulatory strictness and is specific to data protection. We found a survey of 1,000 or more data controllers or firms in the EU, and basically that asked them, is your data controller in your country more strict than ones in other countries? And we found this is very correlated with the post-GDPR growth in vendor use. So here is kind of the bottom quartile in terms of regulatory strictness. This is your Bulgaria and Poland. And down here, this is kind of the Denmark and Netherlands. This is the top quartile of regulatory strictness. So we find this is a pretty compelling evidence that the fear of the regulator is playing an important role in this post-GDPR evolution, but we want to show it in regression form and make sure that it holds up to adding various covariates. So this is in fact what we find, this negative correlation between regulatory strictness and the post-readoption trend. We also use this as a second test for these high revenue shifters. And so we do not actually find this for user income. The sign is counter to our expectations. We think this arises from a correlation between user income and user demand for privacy. However, we are able to replicate the desired sign for a site traffic and ad count. So those are positive and negative. So we conclude that websites' beliefs about enforcement play an important role in explaining the evolution of this industry in 2018. And my last slide here, in summary, we started out with this theoretical tension between privacy and competition policy. This paper provides the first empirical evidence for this tension. The GDPR had its intended consequence of reducing web vendor use and reducing data sharing, but it had several unintended consequences as well. Namely, we saw an increase in vendor concentration, an increase in the concentration of personal data. We saw that websites with the most EU visitors do the least to reduce vendors. And despite the intent of the regulation to harmonize enforcement, there's beliefs about enforcement persists. And finally, we have some sense of what generates this concentration mechanism, and it's largely the big two, firms willing to stick with Google and Facebook. So I'll stop now and look forward to your questions.